Ja, en timme kommer inte räcka. Vi ska läsa högt ur alla de här. An hour won't be enough, I said, because we're going to read from all the books. Actually, these are all books relevant to our discussion. Most of them are here for me to show you and to introduce a little more George Prochnik to you. First, something about this whole event. And I have to admit that it was my idea. I sometimes have ideas, and Lizzie Oved Shea happened to listen to this one. I said, why don't we do something about Arendt, Scholem, and Zweig? And that was at the time when, as you know, the Zweig biography, The Word of Yesterday, had come out and was hugely popular in the world. And one could wonder or ask oneself, why suddenly is this almost forgotten bestseller writer Stefan Zweig coming back with such a vengeance? And of course, as we, I guess, all sense, it has to do with the time we are living in, the times we are living in. And so this book was, as you heard, translated also into Swedish. The book on Zweig, there is the Zweig book, and then comes the Prochnik book on Zweig, The Impossible Exile. And all these bring together a situation in Europe, or a world in Europe, that we might think has some similarities to Europe of today. We can suddenly imagine things happening in Europe that happened in Europe of the 30s, which is the time we will mainly, I think, talk about. And this is, I think, it has to do also with the way that Zweig describes the word of yesterday as a word of relative peace, security, and hope. You can argue whether Zweig really understood the world before 1914, but arguably that was a world that changed radically, first with the First World War, and then, of course, with the rise of Nazism and the Second World War. And even Hannah Arendt, which we'll talk about, describes that shift between the world before the First World War and after as an explosion, as something absolutely radical. Shattered a lot of hope and images of what Europe was and could be. So that, I think, is the reason we decide. And then George, who is an excellent writer, published another book, which is about Gershom Scholem, which we will talk more about. Of the same generation, more or less, in the same predicament, more or less, as Stefan Zweig, being of a German Jewish, or in Zweig's case, Viennese Jewish, bourgeois family, child of quite assimilated, well-doing Jewish parents, and facing basically the same challenges as being part of a world, growing up in a world where it was many doors seemed to open. Acceptance to be a Jew was not anymore a burden, a problem, but it was a possibility to be a Jew and also be part of a new Europe or a new Germany or a fantastic Vienna, blossoming cultural pluralistic Vienna. And the third person that comes into all this and is connected to these two, not only by generation, age, the same background, German, Jewish, the same era, the same experience basically, and also connected clearly, definitely to Gershom Scholem, but as we will find out also, in a way, negatively perhaps more to Stefan Zweig. So what we want to talk about is how these three persons, Stefan Zweig, Gershom Scholem, and Hannah Arendt, responded to that challenge, to their being, to their identity, to their notions of what it means to be a human being, and discovered that in order to meet that challenge, they also had to deal in one way or the other with their Jewish being, which they all perceived a bit differently, and we'll perhaps come to that. So this is, I think, the reason, and the reason why I think this is interesting to talk about is not because we are seeing the same things happening again. The Jewish questions are different today. There is a new situation, but because I think there are very human questions put here. It's by all these three people. They find different, let's put it, different responses a bit to that challenge. And I would say the challenge, and you can argue with me, George. The challenge is deep down a challenge to their self-esteem and dignity as human beings. They had come to believe that, never mind having a Jewish past, or never mind how much they affiliated with Judaism and how much they thought they were Jews, they were all now experienced the threat to their existence as human beings. That's very clearly expressed by Hannah Arendt in the early 30s when she realized that the whole world that she had expected to be part of, the German world of philosophy and great thinking, being the student of Martin Heidegger in the 20s, all that disappeared. All doors closed. And she had realized that what she had to fight for was a sense of dignity, of self. One could argue, I think, that was also the case with Gershom Scholem, whom you know much more about than I, but also as a young boy growing up in Germany, very early on caught on to the idea of Zionism as a way of expressing his need for identity and dignity. And that goes with the whole family. The Scholem family is a very fascinating family, with the brother going to communism and so. But these were all reactions to a threat to a human existence. So I think this is a challenge of a generation that, with all so many differences to what the situation is today. But what I find interesting is, what do we do when we are challenged at the core of our existence, our humanity? We are denied being seen as what we believe we are and what we know we are capable of. Stefan Zweig was the oldest of these three people. I will leave aside for later, because he's a more, I would say also a more complicated case, because he was so definitely a writer, not a political or a philosophical animal, but he was one of the most read writers it's hard to believe, but he was in the 30s definitely. And I can remember when my father, who came to Sweden after the war, when I was barely reading, I read early, but I wasn't. He brought home books by Zweig. He thought I should read. A bit too early, I can tell you. But that was his library. He knew. He thought I should read. I think it was the Magellans traveling around. The first who sailed around the globe. Anyway, so this is. But I will start, and then I will. We'll leave the floor to George, that to say something about the Arendt-Zweig difference. Let's put it that way. It's the easiest thing to talk about, because basically there is one source for this thing, and that's a review that Hannah Arendt wrote about Stefan Zweig's book, The Word of Yesterday. The book was published posthumously. Was it posthumously? One say that? I think it was published in Sweden, actually, by Fischer Verlage, which was then an exile German publisher in Stockholm. And it was published in 1943, and Zweig had committed suicide in 1942 in Brazil, together with his wife. So Hannah Arendt writes this after he's dead, but she doesn't hold her punches, I have to say. She's very harsh. And what she is getting at in that review is the way Stefan Zweig does not, as she sees it, defend his dignity. He gives it up. he accommodates, he wants to please, he wants to stay out of politics. He refuses to criticize the Nazis publicly. He subscribes to a very pacifistic, cosmopolitan, non-political view of human existence and his existence, and basically the existence of Jews. That's what Jews can do and should do. They should not respond with violence. They should not respond with politics. They should cultivate their outsidership in a way. I think he cherished that. He wasn't explicit so much, but I think George can say more about it. But when he talked about it, his perception of Jewishness, this was it. Hannah Arendt, though, she calls him a coward, basically, that he didn't stand up for his fellow Jews, he didn't speak to power, he continued to the very end to write librettos for Richard Strauss, who was then the head of the Reichskammer, or what is it, the Reichsmusikkammer, so he was really serving the Nazi regime, and still he was doing all these things. And so to me, Zweig was really problematic. I didn't bother to think about these things until his book came, and then until your book came. And then I read the Arendt review, and that sheds light, I would say, on two very different perceptions of how human life should be led and how dignity can be achieved. To Zweig, silence, intellectual and spiritual and musical endeavors by an enlightened part of the population was the road to, at the end of the day, some kind of universal brotherhood and peace. That sounds really ridiculous in today, but there were people in that era who subscribed to these cosmopolitan notions, like Albert Schweitzer, Albert Einstein. There was a group, Romain Rolland. They had these ideas, and these ideas were okay until the point where they were totally trashed, and they were shown to be totally unrealistic. So one can say that Zweig was totally unrealistic, but can also say that he represented an idea that at that time still was considered a possible idea to have. And I myself think still that it is a terrific idea, although it has shown itself to not stand in the test of power and politics and history, and eventually it didn't stand the Holocaust. Hannah Arendt, both of these two people were not particularly Jewish. They had grown up in non-Jewish or very assimilated, more or less assimilated backgrounds, and they didn't look for any keys to any Jewish self-esteem or Jewish dignity in Judaism itself. They didn't go there. They didn't think there was anything there, I think. Many of the Jews of that generation, young Jews, were sharing a bit of a negative view, or at least a not very appreciative view of old Judaism and whatever that stood for. And I think that definitely goes for Hannah Arendt. She was not interested. She wrote her dissertation on Augustine, which is a Christian personality, and so she ascribed to the idea, we can say fairly today, of a national and political response to the humiliation of the Jews. So she became a Zionist in the 30s, actively. And she thought that the restoration of sort of a Jewish political presence was absolutely crucial. And I will quote just what she writes then in this book, because it really has to do with what I said, the issue of honor and self-esteem. And she writes about Zweig. Disgrace and honor are political concepts, categories of public life. Businessmen know only success or failure, and their disgrace is poverty. The literati know only fame and obscurity, and their disgrace is anonymity. And that was straight pointing towards a person like Zweig. She's very hard on him in this book. She writes, he failed to perceive that the dignified restraint which society has so long considered a criterion of true Bildung was under such circumstances tantamount to plain cowardice in public life. So what she mocks in him is essentially what he stands for, which is, I would say, a very Jewish way historically of meeting violence and power and persecution. And that is by non-violence and perseverance. And that is how Jews had survived, one can argue, with surviving on their belief that they were meant to suffer, perhaps, or at least that was part of the game. But for Zweig, that was not anymore the case. Or for Hannah Arendt, that wasn't anymore the case. So she thought that Zweig, by clinging to this, really instead was a coward that had abandoned his people in need. So we can come back to this later, but I would say that with these two extreme polarities, Zweig basically succumbing to the silence, to the stoic perseverance, and trust in the spiritual force of the mind and the writer. He was really believing in this, on one hand, and the belief of Hannah Arendt in resort to political action, to re-entering of the Jews into the political arena after 2,000 years. Diaspora versus Zionism were really these two extreme responses. In between them, and then I will pass the word to you, I would say we find Gershom Scholem as somehow a different and in-between person between these two. So,
thank you. Thanks.
what do you say? Oh, sorry. I know you're laughing because you think I'm going out too long. I forgot. I'm going to read about. Sorry. Go ahead, George.
Well, thank you. That's a lot of context. I'm gonna maybe rip things backward to your original statement about why we would even have such an evening as this for a moment. I want to contextualize the conversation, not in historical terms, but really in the immediate situation that we find ourselves in. I believe we confront an emergency. We don't yet know its dimensions or duration, but all of us know we are already in the throes of a cataclysm, however you define it. And the question is, what, if anything, we can do to avert an all-out disaster? The ideas of honor and dignity were certainly pressing for all these figures, but I think those concepts were expressed through the question of how do we matter often? How do we matter? How do we make our words matter? Is there anything then that we can take from these three intellectuals and use now to make things come out differently this time around? For those of us who come out of the Anglo intellectual tradition today, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have completely failed to interrupt the rise of any of the frightening threats now menacing the globe. Resurgent nationalism, tyranny, xenophobia, racism, grotesque economic injustice, sectarian hatred, and environmental catastrophe. All these grave problems, of course, play off and feed one another. I find myself feeling time and again these days that the forces of darkness have the wind in their sails. What can we do? Can we really just accept the inevitable failure of intellectuals to matter in times like these? I was in New York among my little cadre of writer and artist friends last week, and I encountered nothing but cynical resignation and despondency. Things feel different here, but there's a sense that the vortex is really beginning to consume the private space, let alone the public space. Of course, everyone hopes that the elections next week will begin to turn the tide in a more progressive direction, but no one I spoke with was either sanguine about this outcome, nor did anybody feel that even if there was a dramatic victory, it would set things right anytime soon. Something has been let out of the bottle, and no one thinks it's going back again very easily. My most sober, politically incisive friend said to me that he thought in retrospect the first 2 years of the American administration would be looked back on as the tranquil years. An eminent, very brilliant critical theorist told me that he was now questioning his entire life's work. He wonders whether he was deluding himself in his decades of politically radical art criticism, thinking that it had made any difference whatsoever in relationship to the questions of socioeconomic justice all that writing was meant to engage with. Had it just been a displacement from the sphere of explicit politics, he asked me. I don't think so. I can't imagine what this individual's practical politics would look like, and I tend to agree with the position of Masha Gessen, who remarked recently that one of the problems of this time is that our work is not being done. That's to say theory, and that it's not being done because of the all-consuming distraction of this orange face and everything associated with it. But the question that's before us, as it was before these three, the question before us who are privileged right now, insofar as our minds are still free to think, is can we do any better than the intellectual lights of the past to effect positive change through our words? We see the black wave rising. Are we going to drown, or is there still something that can be said to change hearts and minds? The conversation is called Thinking Through Disaster, with a gaze aiming backward and forward in time. And there's a quote from Sholem in this context. The past is still with us. It still has an opening to the present, or even into the future, or the redemption. We are interested in history because therein are hidden the small experiences of the human race, in the same way as there is hidden therein the dynamic light of the future. Within the historical failures, there is still concealed a power that can seek its correction. Zweig put it a little bit differently in his journal in the fall of 1939. He was in London a month after the invasion of Poland. He said, always the same default in mankind, a total failure of the imagination. And by this he meant that he looked around on the streets of London at that time and he thought, no one can see just how black things might become. But maybe the obverse is also true, that we can't always see where hope might emerge from. Certainly, that would be more Sholem's position. We can get to it. And I think we can maybe thumbnail, as Göran started to do, the three paths that these thinkers lay out before us is Arendt on the political, Zweig on the aesthetic, and in the end, Sholem really is on the religious track. It's a theological, philosophical track inflected by literature, heavily inflected by even 20th century writers, particularly Kafka. But it is the effort to see how some kind of theology for modernity might help us to meaningfully engage with the crisis that's upon us. I thought, and it works well with what you were starting to read from Arendt's critique, that we should start with her, because Hannah Arendt is certainly enjoying a vogue right now. She speaks a language I think that we find immediately accessible in its wit, in its snap. There's a kind of cool to her that's very attractive. She has an intellectual lucidity that's expressed in very potent aperçus that we may even quote a few of them. Even the idea of the banality of evil, which we can return to, it's a great phrase, even if in the end we might have to challenge its accuracy. I wanted to read, I think, an astonishing statement that she made in an interview in 1973, because Arendt, more than either of the other figures we're talking about, saw the issue before us, saw the political issue before us, in terms of how language works, advocating for a clarity of language and seeing that muddled language leads to muddled thought. And in fact, that muddled thought expressed through muddled language can be a political strategy of a reactionary leader. She, I think, fell prey to seeing this in her own experience during the Second World War, but she hones the idea, and she wrote in this, or she said in this essay, what really makes it possible for a totalitarian or any other kind of dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. If everyone always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but that no one believes anything at all anymore. And rightly so, because lies by their very nature have to be changed, to be relied, so to speak. A lying government, pursuing shifting goals, has to ceaselessly rewrite its own history, leaving people not only dispossessed of their ability to act, but also of their capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can do then what you please. So she had that. and I think that in that kind of study of how power can be abused, not even by getting people to buy your ideology, but leaving them in a post-ideological state where they were helpless.
It reminds me of Zweig's professed catastrophe, personal catastrophe, the loss of language. To him, the German language was his home. Perhaps to a lesser extent to Hannah Arendt, because she learned quickly to write English. But I know others from that era for whom the usurpation of German by the Nazi, by the forces of lie and persecution, was the worst loss. And I don't know, you can expand on that, but to what extent did that contribute to Zweig's suicide, that he sits in Rio, his whole world of language, all the publishers, all audience is a German speaking, is gone. His books are not published. They are that. I don't know how much that connects to what you said, but I think it does, because I think language and our way of being able to communicate is at the heart of the possibility to keep and restore human dignity. If I come back to that, because the loss of language, the loss of communication, the rule of lie, not the rule of law, the rule of lie, which we are seeing also today coming back, but that was the case in the 30s. I mean, lies were taking over and deciding people's minds and actions. And I think Zweig perhaps was because he was a writer, because he had this strong belief in literature, in music too also, but literature and words. He was the one that felt most deprived, he was most shocked by the fact that suddenly this was taken away from him.
Well, and he was, as you said, he was so unbelievably popular, so that there was a sense. I mean, one thing that he believed for sure, and one reason that he continued to work with Richard Strauss and that he continued to try to get every text that he could published in German in some way that would be read by German speakers was because he never stopped believing. And I respect this position that he might be able to influence somebody. Because the world of his literature at its best was a world giving dignity, to use the word that you've played on, to the interior of even very ordinary people. I mean, this is one thing I think Zweig did. He whether it was a shop girl or a post office worker, whoever it was, he validated the intense operatic drama of their inner life and said, you matter, you have as big a life inside you as royalty. And this way of attempting to ennoble his public, I mean, that sounds, he was elitist, but I don't think in this sense it was an elitist idea. To give an intense form of dignity to their psychologies was one victim of the prescription on his writings that he didn't know how to come back at. I want to say, though, that to your point, it wasn't only in terms of his sense of not being read. There was a conference, the first conference of Penn International that ever took place in New York in, I forget the year, but it was the late 30s or it might have even been the beginning of the 40s. And might have been the beginning of the 40s. And there was an enormous roster of literary luminaries and intellectuals who were each given just a few minutes to speak at this conference. And it was a fundraiser, and there were hundreds of people, and it was being broadcast all around the world. Zweig's address got all the headlines, and the reason for it was because he came out and he expressed absolute shame that the language in which he spoke and thought was the same language in which these brutal civilization-destroying dictates were then being issued. He felt, he described, he used actually very harsh language. He cursed in the course of this talk in a manner that was very unlike him. He was very, what's the word, reserved. But he came out then and said, essentially, that I am polluted and my language is polluted because it is shared by the Nazis. And it made him go back, I think, in different ways and question different aspects of the artistic revolutions that he'd been part of. Because in fact, one of the, I'll say by the side, and we'll come back to this, that I think Arendt missed a great deal of what was happening in the world of yesterday. I don't think Zweig was as removed as she thought, although he set himself up to be seen that way. But Zweig in the world of yesterday, he doesn't attribute the loss of that golden age of security, which he eulogizes, entirely to the forces of darkness politically in the 1930s. He talks about how the artists were the shock troops of the change and how it was the radical writers, the radical musicians, the radical dramatists, who in some way were the ones who disrupted that old order first. So he puts the artist in a very complex position that's not without its political ramifications.
There was a strong belief at that time. We compare, I think, to today that art could ennoble people, and that there was this belief in the force of literature, of poetry, of music, and we can look at that today, and just see in hindsight that wasn't the case. And Nazis also admired Beethoven and Mozart and what have you, and they also admired art to a lot and used it and abused it for their own purposes. So this sense that there was something in the culture and literature, I think it was Zweig's deepest belief that there was such an ennobling capacity or potential in high literature or in cultural excellence. Let's say that that was that is shattered today, I would say. But we are in a similar position in a way, because I wanted to connect to what you said at the beginning, that we are at a loss of language in a sense that I think is comparable to what Zweig sensed. And having seen what President Trump has been doing with the American language in 2 years' time, really undermining all possibility of certain terms to be used because they are already somehow tainted by the way he goes about. And I think your alarm in the beginning is justified, if not only, but to a large extent because of that, because we feel at loss. What are we going to say? Where are the means for communicating something else than these these lies, these distortions, these appeals to the really lowest common denominators of humankind, you know, resentment, hatred, fear, and the power of culture in a broader sense to resist that seems
Yeah.
very weak. And I think that what he sensed at the end of the day.
One common theme of intellectuals in the 30s, or at least in the late 20s, who had any awareness of Hitler was, as I'm sure many of you know, that he was too much of a buffoon, too inarticulate to be taken seriously. There's an amazing passage in Klaus Mann, Thomas Mann's son's memoir, where he describes being in Munich in 1930, and he goes to a tea house, and Hitler is there with some of his cronies at a table next to him. And he looks at him, and he sees him stuffing his face with these little cakes. And he goes off into this rant saying, this pathetic petite bourgeoisie, greedy, gluttonous man cannot possibly ever be the leader of Germany. I've been completely wrong to be anxious about him. He didn't even finish high school. We have this tradition of respecting education. There is no way this man will ever come into power here. And he dismisses him at that moment. Certainly one thing that I heard in New York over and over again during the campaign was, this person is actually quite funny. And I do think that he is a wicked entertainer, but a form of entertainer. And he's too much of a clown to possibly be taken seriously. I remember it was a week before the election, a friend of mine saying, I just can't wait to see Melania on Saturday Night Live. I can't wait. And so the humor, which is a humor also related to the use of language, can be, in fact, blinding to the gravity of this kind of political threat. And in fact, this directly relates to Eichmann in Jerusalem, which we were going to talk about later, but I'll step into now because it's so immediately relevant. Scholem and Arendt fell out over that Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And they fell out on different levels, partly in terms of trying to think about what evil was, but partly Scholem's argument, or his what he couldn't forgive Arendt for, I believe, and I really do believe this, was the tone in which she wrote that book. It was a matter of her language, which was snarky, very funny. It's an extremely readable book. Funny, as she herself admitted during the trial of Eichmann, there were many occasions when it was all she could do, she said, to hold herself back from bursting into laughter at Eichmann's muddied speech in particular. She sets up her own language in that series of essays that became a book. They started out as New Yorker articles. She sets up her own language as the polar opposite. It's absolutely polished. It's absolutely slick. It's absolutely knowing. But even after the Holocaust, she's looking at Eichmann and creating her theory of the banality of evil, which is more nuanced than people who just hear the phrase often think, but still was based on the idea that he was a complete mediocrity, on partially on what she describes again as his unbelievably virtually autistic, she says at one point, inability to string words together to manage to get out anything like a decent statement in his own defense. His language goes all kinds of directions and just has ridiculous. He comes up with ridiculous phrases, his own phrases. He has some remark at one point where he talks about, I really never learned any language but officialese, the equivalent in German. She goes on and on. In fact, just a few years ago, there was a German scholar who published a book. She had access to a whole series of recordings of Eichmann and papers of Eichmann that Hannah Arendt did not have access to. And he was much more of an ideologue, much more coherent, much less of a mediocrity than she thought he was on the basis of the words, on the basis of really the words alone. And she missed it because as a super Central European German intellectual, she had such conviction of language, the sacrosanct nature of German. And even apart from damning his speech, she couldn't accept, I think, that Eichmann might have been using that muddled speech strategically, perhaps like this president. It bought him, because his language was so inexact, it in fact made it much harder for the court to pin him down in any particular area. And I believe we see that now. I don't know who can say how much is intentional, how much is due to the president's character, but the inarticulate nature of everything this person says has obviously been enormously helpful to them.
Let me come back to the world of their thoughts as we can perhaps imagine it. Hannah Arendt, as I mentioned, I think you subscribe to that, thought that by entering the political arena, becoming a political animal, so to speak, the Jews would become those independent individuals participating in this new Aristotelian community of thinking, acting, political animals, and the thinking was very important to her. She thought that by thinking properly, which means can mean many things, man could somehow elevate him or herself from evil, and she accused Eichmann of not thinking. That was he was not able to think. One can say that's a banal, really, accusation. Well, not everybody can think, so you don't have to be evil for that. But she assigned such an importance to that capacity. Like I would say, Zweig assigned an enormous importance to writing and culture and spiritual development. So in that sense, I would argue they are from the same period.
I think that's a good point. I think that it can be argued that she valorizes the political sphere with a utopian vision in the end. She has no less of a utopian sense of what politics can achieve and putting things properly in their political context than Zweig does within the aesthetic. When it leads her to various moments when she flounders in her own thought. I mean, there's a kind of notorious essay, which she later apologized for, but it was very important at the time, where she writes about desegregation of schools, Brown versus the Board of Education, when all of that was at its most heated. And while she is very much arguing for the absolute dignity and equality of African Americans, she argues against desegregation because she feels that the schools, private schools in particular, it's a private space. It isn't. We have to cordon off the private from the we have to cordon off the social and the private from the political, which is its own thing, and we shouldn't be really taking away what is essentially an extension of the parents' home by making them mix with people. This will be counterproductive, etc. And it ends up just being tin-eared and failing to recognize the ways that the social, political, and private spheres bleed into each other necessarily. I mean, this is something that continues to be struggled with, obviously, in America today. I think to some extent in Sweden, from what I understand as well. The question of how identity politics fit into questions of class politics, which she was prescient enough to realize was important, but came down overly endorsing a political solution as the only place in which a government could legitimately intervene.
So here we come to the. I want to bring in Sholem here, and of course, he. This I will just say that if I would say that Zweig and Arendt, in their different ways, represented a very cultural, intellectual responses to whatever happened, then Sholem, although being this scholar in Kabbalah, really the reclused scholar of Jewish mysticism, was at the same time a very hands-on. He moved early on to Palestine. He thought that that was the way of the way of regaining sort of or protecting Jewish life, and he. And the thing is that here is recently came out this correspondence between Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem, and you mentioned they fell out on the issue of Eichmann. That was the final, I think. But they kept a friendship, although they had fallen out quite early on the issue of Zionism. That's and right. The issue of the Jewish state. And Arendt, although she became a Zionist in the 30s, she became also very early on a harsh critic of the way the Zionist project was carried out, and of course, in particular, in relation to the Palestinians or the Arabs, and the lack of imagination or the lack of understanding, she thought, on part of the Zionist enterprise to accommodate for that. So she began to see Zionism as a pure nationalist, extremist nationalist movement. And she fell out on this issue with Scholem. And Scholem somehow said to her, "You don't understand the situation. He was not a reactionary by any means. He was also." But could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, a bit. I mean, because I imagine that Scholem is the least known of these figures, right. I will just say to what you had begun to say in the introduction about his background. Not only was his family very assimilated to the point that famously his father would sometimes go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur and then would cross the street to a restaurant where the head waiter would meet people saying, "Those who are fasting will be served in the back room." And he would bless his cigar jokingly on Shabbat, Borei Pri Hast cigar, or something to this effect. His father took delight in mocking what he saw as the backwardness of religion, and this began to dictate Scholem's whole view because he felt that the assimilation itself was a lie. He said when Scholem began to invest himself in Jewish learning, which was the first step towards him becoming a Zionist, he describes how his father and mother would say to him, basically, "What do you want to go back to the ghetto? What is that?" And he would say to them, "You're in a ghetto and you don't realize it. Where are the Gentile friends coming to visit you? Where is your larger assimilated life?" And this problem he had with the fantasy, what he saw as the fantasy of German Jewish assimilation, extended to his problem with cosmopolitanism, which was not that he would have disagreed with the vision that Scholem had of a kind of symposium of intellectuals talking about different ideas coming from different cultures, different religions, but he just said there is no such thing as this universalism. It has no content. He described his brother, Werner, became, I believe, the youngest member of the German parliament as a representative for the KDP, for the Communist Party. He was a radical thinker. Scholem, when he was in his teens, was a socialist anarchist. and used to tag around with Werner. And he talked about being at one rally where Werner was speaking and the workers were all there, and Werner was very fired up and everyone was responding. And the worker who Gershom was standing next to says, "The Jew does a pretty good job." And for him, that was right. Here we are, the international workers. Where is this universal thing? So Scholem was always very radical and revolutionary in his private life, to the extent of being in ways that neither Zweig nor Arendt were. He was an ascetic, and he was someone who felt you either live entirely by your convictions or you're not really living. Now, his convictions were contradictory in many ways and certainly complex. And when we get to the subject of Zionism, it's very important to realize that when he was, when he was beginning to think about these things during the First World War, at which point he was, by the way, the best friend of Walter Benjamin in Berlin, and the two of them have an extraordinarily precocious, youthful correspondence, some of which you can read and all of which is worth reading about, even if you can't find the individual texts. They were trading back and forth ideas and influencing each other tremendously. But at this point, when Scholem began thinking about Zionism, as he notes in his diary, the first thing we have to recognize about Zionism is that we have no idea what it is. It has no definition. Certainly for him, it was not a political project. And in fact, he says when he begins trying to lay out a definition for Zionism, he says, Zionism, let me see if I can get this right. I have it written down, so I'll double check. He says, Zionism must consist of four things. And he says we need a stringent historical consciousness. That's the first criteria. We have to have a sense of social responsibility regarding all humanity, misery over the conditions in Europe, and general spiritual anguish. That's the entire definition of Zionism that he comes up with as a young person. And he was part of a group of Central European intellectuals who thought that there would be a purpose in having kind of, I guess you would say the intelligentsia, but not exclusively the intelligentsia, go over to, it didn't have to be Jerusalem, but maybe Jerusalem would be best, somewhere over there to the east. And they would form some sort of organization that would serve as a kind of engine to reinvigorate diaspora Judaism. Because, per your remarks, his feeling 2 decades before the Holocaust was that European Jewry was dead. And it was a form of death through suicide, death through becoming overly bourgeois, death through subscribing to the most toxic aspects of mainstream German bourgeois culture. So his positions evolve, for sure, on Zionism, and he was one of the primary figures in the public life of the state, not just a professor, at the time when refugees began coming over. And he understood that he could no longer hold his kind of very elevated elite vision of what Zionism should be. But he also wrote in many places, most explicitly in his correspondence with Walter Benjamin, that then Palestine, he said, should never have been imagined as the solution to the Jewish problem. It was a mistake. It couldn't accommodate everyone. It was not going to work. And he, throughout his life, he was one of the first signatories on a letter published by the Hebrew University in Jerusalem after the '67 war, saying that the territories should be immediately returned. He understood that the more bellicose, more nationalistic aspects of the state project were immensely dangerous. But he was also there.
May I? Yeah. I have a question on Scholem for you, but I want to introduce, because people who haven't read your books, you should. It's the way you also bring in yourself in both books, but in the book on Scholem in particular, which has the subtitle, so I don't misread it, Searching for Gershom Scholem and Jerusalem, which means it's also about your own moving to Israel, to Jerusalem, to search for a Jewish existence. You actually converted to Judaism because only your father was Jewish. And the book, I have to say, and advertise, it's very much about that too. So the search for Sholem and the search for George Prochnik's Jewish identity, how it ends, and I won't say anything about that. But that's also how interesting. But the question then, among these three Jewish persons, Sholem is the only one that goes to Judaism itself
That's right.
to look for inspiration.
That's right. And one thing that, in fact, he hated in the mainstream German Zionist youth movement that he was part of was that there was no content to it in terms of Jewish texts. He felt that you couldn't, whatever your vision of moving forward was, it was impossible without the language. You had to know Hebrew, and you had to know something about what this people's traditional identity was that you were purporting to be rescuing by this Zionist act, whatever form it would take as it was seen then in the 1920s. He deplored throughout his life the failure of people who wanted to identify themselves with Jewish intellectualism or Jewish politics, or let alone with a Jewish homeland movement. The idea that you could do so without understanding where it all came from. And on that level, I think he wasn't at all reactionary. I think he was understanding something that we do very much grapple with in this moment in time. Everything dilutes and becomes so quickly impossibly vague without having the real chops of knowing what these texts consisted of. And in fact, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that, and I'm not by any means the only person to say this, but Sholem's Kabbalah itself, and he did, I think pretty much single-handedly, make Jewish mysticism an academic field. But his vision of Kabbalah was also, to a huge extent, a creation of his own experience, the ways he read the texts, what he was looking for. It's not that he made things up, but he twisted texts. And there's a very brilliant revisionist scholar of Sholem, Moshe Idel, who in particular has attacked Sholem's failure to properly recognize what the Eastern European Jewish experience, Jewish mystical experience consisted of. He really saw Sholem's Kabbalah as having been defined by German Jewish exile experience. And in fact, it's true that the core arc, if you can have a core arc, the major trajectory that he looks at, that Sholem looks at in Kabbalah, he looks at many, many different things. But he comes back and back to the theme of exile, the Spanish exile, and the ways that played out over time as the genesis of the theological ideas that the principal Kabbalists were grappling with. So that there's a very important idea which Sholem writes about, as the idea that part of God is exiled from God's own self, and that there's an effort through this difficult to define character of the Shekhinah, kind of the female aspect of God, but not quite, to reunite the divine with the divine and bring back a cosmic wholeness. And this idea of exile projected into the Godhead, in Sholem's eyes, was a way that these little communities of Jews who had lost so much were able, not in a Zweigian manner to gain dignity, but through writing, but to understand their miserable experience as also having a cosmic correlative, a way of enlarging their own suffering on a much grander canvas.
Can we, to wrap this up, say something about the relevance, after all, of these three persons? today. I would say something maybe provocative, but Sholem, by going back to the spiritual realm of Jewish experience and trying really to find in it inspiration, ideas by which to live in the modern world. I think his, as you say, his search into the Kabbalah is done from his present day perspective and situation. And I think we live now in a world where the issue of religions, to put it largely, is there, and we have we have difficulties in grappling with it. We don't know what to do with it, and there is a fear of even going into the realm of the spiritual or that kind of human experiences. But Sholem, as you say, he was a radical, he was a progressive, and he obviously thought that there was something to find there. So how do you see that? And also, about the other two guys here, Zweig and Aaron? What can we say about them today?
Well, I mean, I do think that Sholem, weirdly, because he is arguably, well, not arguably, he is certainly the most focused on Jewish experience, may offer more clues for Jewish and non-Jewish readers to think about other ways of viewing this moment in time, because he was so conscious of apocalyptic danger and also of certain kinds of potential. He spoke of, there was an idea that he talked about increasingly in later years of history having these, what he called plastic hours. And they were times when things were in motion. The pieces no longer fit together correctly, the edges were effaced, and they were going to rearrange themselves. And in those moments, he thought, and it was really a religious sense, that you could not foreclose on the possibility of anything happening, and that there was an opportunity as well as tremendous risk. I'm going to read a couple of quotes from him. It's precisely the lack of transition between history and the redemption, which is always stressed by the prophets and the apocalypists. Their ideas of history have nothing to do with modern conceptions of development and progress. It always comes very suddenly. He wrote, and this is an idea that Benjamin then picks up in a completely secular context, at every hour, so long as religion constitutes some kind of living force within a person, that person has the potential to bring about the revolution of redemption. And he uses the word revolution advisedly, and is even called upon to bring it about. And in terms of thinking how their texts can be used very specifically at this moment, two further quotes, quick. He wrote, "It's a profound truth that a well-ordered house is a dangerous thing. When a little messianic apocalypticism penetrated this house, it became a kind of anarchic breeze. A window is open through which the winds blow in, and it's not quite certain just what they bring in with them." There's tremendous danger in that kind of attitude as well. Mm. And it's a danger, in fact, that he may have helped to actualize in Jerusalem, where some of his students, although Sholem constantly said that he was 100% against the idea of religious messianism entering into the political sphere, it's a bit like the warning on cigarettes. I say at one point in books, don't smoke, it's bad for you. And a number of his students actually did go on to live in the settlements, and some of them even played important roles there. Wow. But there's another aspect of how his thought led him, I think, into a concrete way of reimagining gaps between people. He wrote in the context of the Jewish-German dialogue, or lack thereof, in the aftermath of the Second World War. something that goes against all of our notions today of the key to progress when people hate each other being understanding. He wrote, "The abyss that events have flung open between the two, Germans and Jews, can be neither measured nor fathomed. Unlike many in Israel, I do not believe that the only possible means of overcoming the distance is to admit the abyss into our consciousness in all its dimensions and ramifications. We can't really, in Israel, he's saying, take on the camps. We can't do it. There isn't anything to understand. It's beyond us. It's mere rhetoric, he said, to say it so. For in truth, there is no possibility of comprehending what has happened. Incomprehensibility is of its essence. No possibility of understanding it perfectly, and thus of incorporating it into our consciousness. Abysses, and this is also a religious idea, are flung open by events. Bridges are built by goodwill. Bridges are needed to pass over abysses. They are the product of conscious thinking and willing. Where love is no longer possible, a new understanding requires other ingredients: distance, respect, openness, and open-mindedness, and above all, goodwill. So he felt that there were, rather than endlessly saying that we understand each other's pain and thinking that we're going to dig ourselves out of our mutual animosity and the pain that we feel, whether it's division within a particular state between the right and the left or between different demographics, and I try to apply this to the Jewish-Palestinian story. He says, essentially, the history is there as an undislodgeable absolute, crimes that cannot be corrected. But maybe you can still open yourself to the other person if your desire is to create a bridge to the one who feels aggrieved. And maybe in that articulation, conscious articulation of goodwill, something else can be broken down that understanding can never master. I want to say in respect to Sholem that one of the real revelations for me as I read this book, I'd read it once years before I began studying it, and it can come across as sort of cold, and he doesn't talk about his personal life at all. In fact, he doesn't even mention his second wife, let alone his first wife, who was beside him.
Which book are you talking about?
Now, The World of Yesterday.
The World of Yesterday, okay. You're talking about Zweig now, okay.
Sorry, yeah, I'm switching to Zweig. Maybe I didn't say that, I apologize.
Oh, okay,
but and it can come across also as here are these endless, this is something that Arendt critiques him for directly. She talks about, the world of yesterday that Zweig portrays was anything but the world of yesterday. He lived, she says, behind these golden trellises, and they had these wonderful conversations together, and what a fantasy it was. But once you understand the context in which this book was written, which was Zweig was months away from committing suicide. He was, strangely enough, in a place called Ossining, New York, which is a couple of hours up the Hudson. It's the site of the Sing Sing prison. Living in, I've been there, a miserable little bungalow that people who went there and were all like, they couldn't believe that this person who had been at the center of Viennese culture, the center of actually European artistic, intellectual life, was living in this awful little house in this strange, remote suburb. And Zweig was writing like a maniac. In fact, he wrote as perhaps 400 pages in 4 weeks in the summer of 1941. He killed himself in February of 1942. And I'm convinced that this whole book is in some way a kind of message in the bottle to the future. He's not talking about life as it was in all of its complexities. And in fact, Arendt says he doesn't mention unemployment, and that was such a huge thing. He does mention unemployment. He mentions things. But what he's, I believe, trying to do is say these kinds of conversations, these kinds of cosmopolitan discussions, these sorts of gatherings that were held, they were building a sort of civilization. They were building a kind of cultural exchange that must be taken as a paradigm of that can instruct people going forward. I think he'd already made the decision to kill himself. And this was an effort not to record exactly what happened to him, but some kind of pattern that could be taken up as people tried to reconstruct civilization from the ashes of what was already, at the time he was writing, clearly going to be a catastrophic conflict. So a lot of what comes across as naive in that book is something else. I'll finish.
Yeah, sure.
Yep. There's even a moment in the preface where he talks about how could our fathers have had such a delusion that this world was so safe and so secure and so wonderful as it was. And then he writes that even now, knowing everything that I do, there is something in me that can't let go of that delusion. If these realities that are before my eyes now are the realities, what am I getting by staring at them? And I don't think it's a purely escapist sentiment. He's also saying that in that place of artistic dreams, maybe this work of the imagination can project us out of this moment and find kinds of solutions that artists are sometimes as responsible for as politicians. And in fact, politicians, at least in my part of the world today, have failed so utterly. We, I think, are as potentially as likely to benefit from cultivating the arts, just the part of the mind that thinks beyond where we are now, as the part that stares at this darkness in which we are seeming to submerge steadily.
That's a beautiful end, because I think what these three people left to us is creations of imagination in three really different ways of imagining another world than the one that exists. And there has been for a long time now the sense that there's nothing we can do about the world. It is. There is no alternative, and so forth and so on. And the burden or the pressure of feeling that there is no other way of seeing things, imagining things, is, I think, contributing to a sense of powerlessness, and that in its turn gives way to dark forces. So in that sense, I think I read the Word of Yesterday exactly as you say. It's a kind of an inspiration in a situation where we need to be able to imagine that it could be differently. And I think Gershom Scholem, by going to the language of the spiritual and affirming wholly different ways of perceiving the world that we are not allowed to today, because scientific such and such, this is fantasy, but allowing it is still, I think, a great thing to something to cherish. And Arendt, of course, in all her work, you can also say that people still read her for inspiration rather than for whatever critique she had at a certain moment of time. And of course, the ideal of the free human being on the stage of politics, the social being, is still a very beautiful dream.
And there also, with Arendt, there are just amazing moments where she contradicts herself in beautiful ways, and sort of feels there can only be these fragments of truth. I always love this moment when she is kind of accosted by, if I remember correctly, her niece or her great niece, who says, Hannah Arendt famously had this love affair with Martin Heidegger when she was young, and then helped his rehabilitation after the war. And basically her niece cousin says to her, Hannah, how could you? How could you do that with everything you know and everything you've written about and everything this man is? And she just said in her famously husky voice, "Some things are stronger than a human being." So she could also say these things, which are completely outside the realm of politics.
So we have been going on for a while, and we have about 15 minutes, let's say 10, 15. And I don't see you very well, but I know there are some persons out there knowing definitely a lot more than I do. Well, I'll start with David. No, you're not there. Oh, there's someone. I thought it was you. No, you're sitting there. Okay, so here is one then, and then another one up there.
Hi.
Yeah, yeah. That's what I see. Go ahead.
Yes, I
And,
was.
and introduce yourself if you wish to. So.
Yes, my name is Bill Borden. I'm an American, but I've lived here for a long time. Um, I was really glad to hear how you pointed out the importance of words and how we use them, and I thought perhaps that could help solve a problem. Uh, you have mentioned of how divisive things are in the U.S. There's an election coming, have a president that most of us don't want. But how can we talk to people who support these evil forces, sometimes known as Trump voters? How do you communicate with them and bring about change?
Well, I mean, if I had an easy solution, I'd be running for office. But one thing I can say for sure, I had a friend who followed actually the Democratic campaign around just before the election and went to town after town where the thing that stunned them most was not any of the opinions that were expressed by individuals. It was the fact that whether they went into the local supermarket or the bowling alley or the restaurant, in some cases the school, in some cases the hospital waiting rooms, Fox News was playing everywhere all the time. And she saw this repeatedly. One warning that that Zweig reiterates over and over is that propaganda deadens the capacity of people to hear anything but more propaganda. He writes extremely eloquently about the efficacy of propaganda. And if we think about the moment that we're in now, for sure we are facing something even beyond what he could have conceived of. So I honestly think part of the solution to things will be legislative in terms of what can be. I don't think it will be easy to unplug people from their multiplying feeds that reinforce their own narratives of what's happening right now. But I think we have to find we have to shape forms of public space, physical spaces, not abstract things, where conversation can feel more neutral than it does right now. And that in itself is a utopian idea based on where things stand. But I don't think that the spaces that exist are serving that necessity. One of the ideas that Zweig had, again showing that he was not completely impractical, and he was trying to flog this in as late as 1932, but he'd begun much before. Was that there had to be there had to be an international university with campuses all over, with compulsory student exchanges, so that me, with all my nationalist American beliefs, would have to go sit in a campus in Abu Dhabi or in Prague or wherever it was. And honestly, I think that young people, education is more likely to be, even though that postpones the solution, a way to change the tenor of hearing and speaking without hearing, and refusing to really take in another opposing view than anything else. I think it was a pretty good idea for Europe at the time.
It's over there. Ernst? Yeah, I think. Do you have?
I'm Ernst Hollander, and I'm very happy to have heard you. I've worked with Swedish Jews for Israeli-Palestinian peace for some 35 years now, and I'm part of this very big group who are extremely depressed, as you expressed in the first things you said. And I very much like the last ideas you spoke about spaces, because the invasion of economics, I'm an economist also, in all spheres of life is extremely dangerous. And I think that the secular religion today, in political circles at least, is growth, etc. And this precludes all the spaces, all the persons, all the bridges that you have been talking about. So I was very impressed to read about your personal life with this going away from the US, going to Israel, going back. During this trip, where did you see the bridges? Where did you see, and where did you see the bridges, the people who actually still are able to hope, are still... and that doesn't only apply, I mean, this is much broader than authors, than people who are able to do what you are doing.
Well,
so I want, like Masha Gessen, she was talking about all the people that maybe were just as important as the persons who were able to write. Okay.
thank you. I will say again that if I have to think of the most hopeful space that I saw when I was living there, and now that's a long time ago, and things have gotten worse, but it was the Palestinian Jewish schools. I had a friend who was involved with the founding of one in Jerusalem. It's an enormously successful project. It's a kind of exchange that is desperately needed now, because even if you have a hardened older generation, the kids are playing together. And in fact, one of the sadnesses that I know about, I don't know what the story is now in Jerusalem, but in Haifa, where there is the closest thing to, a kind of parity in population size, close, not exact, but there are more parents. There's a huge waiting list. I mean, I know someone who sends their kids to this school now, and they told me, within the last year, they said there's a long waiting list, that they just can't accommodate them. There should be more of these schools. There should be more opportunities for young people before they too deeply take in this poison of racism and nationalist conviction, to meet each other on the playground. But I want to say one side piece to that too, what you said about growth. There was a revelatory moment for Zweig. And actually, one of the most extraordinary things that he wrote is this book, Brazil, Land of the Future. He went to Brazil in the mid-1930s, and he was blown away by what he saw. In the introduction of this book, it's a very humble introduction, he said he went to this country with all the prejudices of a typical European, expecting to find a swampy backwater for adventurers and all sorts of basically ignorant natives running around. He had no idea what he's going to find. He'd been invited there to speak. And in fact, he discovered a deeply cultured society in which productivity and growth were not the ultimate standards of societal success. And he writes there how it completely rearranged his sense of how you define a thriving culture. Because even then, even in the mid-1930s, he was still locked in this idea, well, if you have a GDP of a certain thing and you're making so many cars and you have so many nice, comfortable furnishings in your home and people have a decent income, this is success. But he said, I went there and it was a poor society, but at the same time, he was seeing people of different color holding hands, walking down the street, and no one was looking at them twice. Zweig was definitely not aware of some of the deeper racial tensions that did exist in Brazil. But compared to what was going on in Central Europe at that time, just to have two people who looked completely different, that came from completely different European and indigenous people background, able to be touching in public and to be engaging in all sorts of different ways, and to find that people could be intensely literate, even erudite, artistic, without being focused on how much stuff we acquire. That was very important for him, and it began to make him rethink the whole path that he'd been on in Europe. And in fact, it's why, even though it was unsuccessful, he attempted to restart his life in Brazil at the very end.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Yeah, Mortenaro. I'd like you to. We mentioned very briefly the banality of evil, and that people have panned this, they've agreed with it, but it seems to me that whenever I hear about a bombing or use of violence, we are now able to do such horrible things without seeing the people that we're hurting. A pilot who drops a bomb or kills people and enemies. You have a horrible evil that is done in a very banal way. And I'd like you to comment on how you see Hannah Arendt's approach and where you think she went right and where she went wrong. Briefly.
Yeah. Well, one of the points that Hannah Arendt makes in her correspondence with Scholem when he begins attacking the idea is she says it's not that there isn't such a thing as evil, but she sees it more as a fungus spreading over a society rather than being a deep truth. And she's interested in the political, corporate structures that enable the kind of anonymity that you're talking about to take to thrive. Scholem was very disappointed specifically because she had in the past, and he continued to adhere to the idea that there was such a thing as radical evil, what he called radical evil, which is theologically inflected, but not exclusively a theological idea, as also comes out in that correspondence. He thinks that the idea of this blank drone pilot sitting in a trailer somewhere in the Southwest, firing off a device that causes death, he doesn't see it as the principal problem. I think that's correct. He would never deny that the Nazis needed that as part of their apparatus. He would never have said that that didn't exist. But he felt that what Arendt missed is how much people can enjoy evil. He has a line in one of the letters where he says something to the effect, this may be exact, that the gentlemen enjoyed their mischief so long as they could. It was different, obviously, once the party was over. And he says, he didn't imagine Eichmann strutting up and down in his uniform, lording it over these people who were absolutely under his control as a purely functionary executor of this program. And certainly, I in fact wrote a little essay about this when the changeover in American politics has happened, because I have to say, I think we've seen enormous pleasure in evil doing. And I think I would call it radical evil. And that all of these many people who become caught in the cogs, there's often is, at this stage of things, there is a personal gain. There is an opportunity to, if nothing else, to get money. And how much of the Nazi project was facilitated by the Prussian industrialists who felt, well, we can rein this guy in when the time comes. Right now, though, businesses were rearming and businesses booming. There was a tremendous sense of opportunity. And I think absolutely that that's been on display again. So Arendt's work was very important in understanding how we can do things if our face isn't showing that we couldn't, were we exposed. But I don't think it gets at the conducting of the evil enterprise. That's not mechanical, and many people can be involved on that executive end as well.
There is of course, and that is also, I think, pronounced in Zweig's book, the realization that there is a point in which normalization of the unthinkable happens. I mean, that what you couldn't imagine yesterday is just normal today. And it doesn't take much fantasy to see that we are there now.
You know, you made the point early on about
Yeah.
about Trump's language
Right.
and the debasing aspect of that. Actually, I think there's been a tremendous debasement in consequence on the left as well. And that's been normalized. It's just everything shutters down a level.
So this is I think one thing one could take away when reading all these three people to regain a certain sense of the unfathomable, the thing that you couldn't imagine, and which all these three were facing and responded differently. I think, if I have to say, I think Zweig, after being also, I think the most sensitive in a way of these people, embodied that. And I'm fascinated by your story that he actually intended this as a kind of testimony to humanity. I don't know, but it's fascinating because the book, to me, reads a bit like that.
He gave a speech that was the genesis of it in Paris just before the fall of France, actually in 1940, called the Vienna of Yesterday. And there, again, having already been to Brazil, he was critiquing the German model of growth and saying, if this is where it got us, how can we look on this as civilization? And he makes a kind of extraordinary move that he then doesn't replicate in the book itself, where he says, you know, the Germans always used to look down on us Viennese as the idlers. We spent all our time at the opera. We spent all of our time making music, writing. Well, they were the ones actually getting something done. But he says after the First World War, when the state had gone to whatever it was, 40 million to 4 million, virtually overnight, that all of the ways that the Viennese had dedicated themselves to the arts, whether it was handicraft or whether it was a form of imaginative thinking, was what enabled them to rebuild the entire city within a few years, and in fact make it one of the great socialist experiments in modernity, something that was looked at by the Russians, etc. That it was, he says, to use the Hebrew, davka, because we were only thinking about the arts, we could deal with catastrophe when it came and renew ourselves in the aftermath.
Let me thank George and also mention his books for those who haven't read them. I strongly recommend. This is Stranger in a Strange Land, Searching for Gershom Scholem and Jerusalem. And the other one is in Swedish, actually, but I have the English one, The Impossible Exile, Stefan Zweig at the End of the World. Absolutely fascinating reading. You write so well, George, and I have to thank you for coming all the way here.
Thank you. Thank you to Lizzie as well. Thank you. Thank you very much.